You step onto the bridge at dawn, and within 10 paces, the world closes over your head. Timber-framed houses rise 4 and 5 stories on either side, leaning towards each other until they meet in the middle, until the sky itself is simply gone. You can hear the river, a deep, churning roar beneath your boots, but you cannot see it. You pass a bookseller, a haberdasher, a tavern pouring its early smoke into the gloom, and it hits you, suddenly, that you are walking through a small city, suspended above a living river, just a Tuesday morning in Elizabethan London. Welcome back to History Recreated. Tonight, we are stepping into the greatest, loudest, most dangerous, and most ferociously alive city of its century. The reign of Queen Elizabeth I, from 1558 to the spring of 1603. 45 years in which a bruised, battered little kingdom transformed itself into the centre of a world that did not yet know it had a centre. A city where Shakespeare was quietly reinventing what a story could be, where merchants were assembling the first global corporations, and where one extraordinary bridge carried an entire town on its back, suspended above the Thames for nearly 400 years. This is what it looked and smelled and sounded like to be alive in it. When Elizabeth took the throne in 1558, London was a city of roughly 100,000 people. By the time her reign closed, it had doubled. 200,000 souls packed into a city without running water, sewers, or street lighting. A city that was, by every rational measure, deeply difficult to survive in, and that people could not stop pouring into from every direction. They came because it was where everything was happening. The Royal Exchange opened its doors in 1571, founded by the merchant Thomas Gresham, a purpose-built centre of commerce modelled on the great bourses of Antwerp and Venice, where goods and credit could be traded under a single roof. London was quietly redefining itself as the financial heart of Northern Europe. The great trading companies that would shape the next 3 centuries were being chartered in this era: the Muscovy Company, the Levant Company, the Venice Company. And in the final year of Elizabeth's reign, in 1600, a small administrative act granted a royal charter to something called the East India Company. A handful of signatures, a few dozen merchants, and the quiet beginning of the largest commercial empire the world had ever seen. The Thames was the artery that carried all of it. From the riverbanks, you would have looked out on a forest of masts, merchant ships from Portugal, the Baltic, the Ottoman coast, unloading spices, silks, timber, wine. Wherrymen in flat-bottomed boats ferried passengers across for a single coin. The wealthier sort kept private barges with liveried crews. The river was not a boundary in this city. It was a road, the busiest road in London, alive from well before dawn until well after dark, its watermen shouting over each other and over the constant rolling thunder of the water beneath the bridge. And then there was the bridge itself. Old London Bridge had been standing since 1209, built over 33 years by the priest-architect Peter of Colechurch, on 20 stone arches stretched across the full width of the Thames. And here is where it gets a little wild, because almost as soon as it was finished, people started building on top of it. By the Elizabethan era, the bridge carried around 200 houses and shops in continuous rows along both sides of its length, some of them rising 4, 5, and even 6 stories high. The road between them was barely 12 feet wide. Carts meeting in opposite directions simply could not pass. Fistfights were common. Livestock was regularly lost over the sides, And in the middle of this chaos, cross buildings spanned the roadway from one side to the other at upper floor level, linking the houses above the traffic. You could walk from one end of the bridge to the other and spend a serious chunk of the journey inside what genuinely felt like an enclosed medieval corridor. No view of the sky, no awareness that you were suspended above a tidal river at all. Then, in 1579, something even more extraordinary arrived. Nonsuch House, its name meaning quite literally none other like it, was a prefabricated palace shipped in pieces from the Netherlands, transported across the North Sea, and reassembled on the bridge without a single iron nail. The entire structure was held together with wooden pegs. I want you to really sit with that detail for a second. A palace crossed the sea in crates, put together like a giant wooden puzzle on top of a medieval bridge in the middle of a tidal river. It stood where the old drawbridge tower had once been, crowned with 4 onion-shaped domes at its corners and painted in brilliant colors. An early burst of Renaissance architecture dropped into the middle of a medieval street. It became, almost overnight, the most coveted address in London. The southern gatehouse of the bridge played a darker role too. Above its archway, the crown displayed stark public warnings to anyone who had defied the throne, lingering reminders of failed rebellions, left on open view for every soul crossing into Southwark. There was a formal, salaried office devoted entirely to keeping that display in working order. A generation before Elizabeth, her father Henry VIII had used the bridge's gate as pure political theatre. And Elizabeth, I have always suspected, understood that language even better than he did. She never flinched from using it. Below all of this, below the shops, the houses, the painted domes of Nonsuch, the Thames was doing something remarkable and terrifying. The 20 stone piers of the bridge compressed the river's entire tidal flow into roughly 1/3 of its natural width. When the tide ran, the water on the upstream side could sit as much as 5 or 6 feet higher than on the downstream side. The result was a set of churning, roaring rapids crashing through every single arch, what one observer in 1700 would describe as a frightful roaring of the bridge waterfalls. 2 great water wheels, installed by the engineer Peter Maurice in the early 1580s, made it worse. They gave the city its first pressurized water supply, but they narrowed the channels further and drove the current even harder. To take a boat through those arches while the tide was running was called shooting the bridge, and it was, by every honest account, the kind of thing that ended careers and reputations on a regular basis. The river would seize a boat, spin it, slam it against the stone piers, the massive irregular foundations known as starlings, and pull it under. The Duke of Norfolk's barge once struck a starling on a November afternoon, and many of those on board were lost to the river. Cardinal Wolsey, in his constant journeys between York Place and Greenwich, refused the passage outright. He would disembark, walk around the entire bridge on foot, and reboard on the other side. This gave rise to a saying that echoed through London for generations. London Bridge is for wise men to go over and for fools to go under. And every generation, of course, produced its fresh supply of fools. That is something I find quietly funny about this period, and honestly about our own too. On the south bank of the Thames, just past the bridge, London's entertainment district had taken root in the borough of Southwark, outside the city's formal jurisdiction, well beyond the reach of the aldermen and moral reformers who ran the square mile to the north. Here, in the marshy ground between river and field, the new theatres had gathered. The Rose, the Swan, the Hope. And, from the summer of 1599 onward, the Globe. The story of how the Globe actually got built is one of the great acts of theatrical defiance in history, and it genuinely still makes me grin. Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, had been performing for years in a wooden playhouse called the Theatre up in Shoreditch. The lease on the land expired. The landlord, a man named Giles Allen, declared that the building itself had become his property. The company, led by the Burbage brothers, disagreed. So on the night of December 28, 1598, while Giles Allen was away celebrating Christmas at his country estate, they arrived at the theatre with a carpenter named Peter Street and a team of workers. They dismantled the entire building, beam by beam, labelling every single piece. They loaded the timber onto carts, moved it across London, ferried it over the Thames, and stored it near Bridewell for the winter. And in the spring of 1599, they rebuilt their stolen theatre in Suffolk. And they called it the Globe. It stood 30 metres in diameter, 20 sides to its walls, open to the sky above the yard. 3 stories of tiered galleries wrapped around a stage that jutted out into the open air. Up to 3,000 people could attend a single performance. For a penny, the same penny that would buy you admission to a coffee house a century later. A groundling could stand in the yard through a 2-hour performance of Hamlet or Julius Caesar or A Midsummer Night's Dream, jostled by the crowd, rained on if the weather turned, pressed close enough to watch an actor's face change. The wealthy paid more and sat in the galleries. Nobles sometimes sat right on the stage itself. And the plays being performed here were new, entirely new, in a way that is genuinely difficult to grasp from this distance. Tragedy and comedy and history mixed in forms that had no real precedent. Characters spoke in language that felt both elevated and immediate. A single afternoon could give you a gravedigger cracking jokes about mortality, and then a prince quietly asking what it means to exist. And the audience understood, without ever needing it explained, that these were not separate things at all. Shakespeare himself would have crossed London Bridge nearly every time he walked between his lodgings on the north side of the river and his theatre on the south. He would have passed under the gatehouse. He would have heard the rapids. He would have squeezed through the 12-foot corridor between the overhanging houses, past the barbers and booksellers and haberdashers, and he almost certainly walked directly beneath the painted domes of Nonsuch House without ever bothering to glance up. The London he moved through was a city in the middle of becoming something, not yet entirely sure what. An empire still in the egg, a literary culture just finding its own voice, a commercial civilization quietly assembling the institutions the modern world would inherit, and a bridge that was, in itself, a kind of perfect metaphor for the whole improbable experiment. Magnificent and structurally precarious, teeming with life, roaring with the sound of water that would, eventually, bring the whole thing down. Old London Bridge finally came down in the 1830s, after more than 600 years. The houses had already been cleared away in 1762. Nonsuch House had been demolished long before that. The southern gatehouse was quietly emptied of its old function and became simply a gate. The original site of the Globe was paved over, a housing estate was built on top of it, and then in 1989 it was excavated, its foundations preserved now beneath a car park. A full reconstruction of the theatre opened in 1997, about 750 feet from where Shakespeare himself stood. If you stand on the south bank of the Thames today and look north toward the bridge, the river is quiet, broad, tamed, crossed by a dozen modern structures. The roaring is gone, the rapids are gone, the painted domes are gone. What remains is a city that still runs, in ways it does not always fully recognize, on decisions made when it was first figuring out what it wanted to be. If this story took you somewhere tonight, if a single detail stopped you and made you sit up, go down to the comments and tell me which one. I mean it, I read them. And then hit that subscribe button, because this channel is where we keep bringing these lost worlds back to life, one frame at a time. History Recreated will see you in the next one.